Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Elizabeth Pena. I am the director of the Center for the Arts and Religion at the Graduate Theological Union. And this is our third Thursday at the Berkeley Art Museum program that usually we do in real life. We go to the Berkeley Art Museum and talk about a work of art and spend the rest of our time walking around and discussing what we see on display. Obviously, we can't be at the Berkeley Art Museum. I've given myself a Berkeley Art Museum background, so I'm kind of pretending that I'm there right now. But we're so lucky that Professor Devin Zuber is our leader for today's visit to the Berkeley Art Museum because he's done this for us several times before. So he knows the ropes, and he was very gracious and willing to step into this virtual experience for us today. So I'm just going to introduce Dr. Zuber and hand the reins right over to him. Devin is Associate Professor of American Studies, Religion, and Literature at the Graduate Theological Union. He's also Chair of the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies and Religion. His focus is on literature, religion, and the arts. And he has been doing a lot of work with environmental studies, eco-criticism, and religion and the arts, and is the author of, I don't know if you can't really, this book, recently, A Language of Things, Emanuel Swedenborg and the American Environmental Imagination, which
is only coming out on my computer,
which I can highly recommend. So I guess that's, Devin, if you could say something before you start about your research interests and a little bit in the field of sustainability studies, that would be a great way to get us started. Okay.
Sure,
thanks.
Great. Well, warm welcome to everybody. This is such a pleasure. And I have to admit, a uniquely phantasmagoric, almost hallucinatory experience. I feel like I'm in a dream because all these different pieces of my life, from my mom to relatives to people from different professional worlds. I think my friend Laura from London is tuning in late at night, and they're all in the same space. So, there's some odd things about doing everything online, then sort of wonderful things, sort of fusion of different places. You should all be automatically muted as we go into our gallery talk. And later on, we'll be unmuting folks when we're going to do some question and dialogue and back and forth. If for whatever reason you're not already muted, as you should be through Zoom, just click on your little microphone so it doesn't create reverberation or feedback. And on the side is the chat and dialogue board, and feel free to use that to raise your hand if you have a question or to ask comments and the like. So again, my name is Devin Zuber, and I teach at the GTU in Berkeley, the Graduate Theological Union. And besides wearing a hat as chair of the Department for Historical and Cultural Studies of Religion, I also co-lead a new environmental humanities think tank and incubator called Sustainability 360. I co-lead this with Dr. Rita Sharma from the Center for Dharma Studies, which is our locus for doing Hindu and Vedantic thought at the GTU. And we've already done a number of public events and talks tied to Sustainability 360, including coming up next year, assuming things go back to normal and we have a campus to walk around on. We're doing a large conference on ecological economics and sustainability in spring of 2021. So you can check out our initiative on the GTU website. And it's an initiative that has the arts front and center. So it's really cool that I get a chance to talk about art, which has direct environmental implication for care. So this is a bit of a thought experiment. We've never tried transposing our gallery mode onto Zoom, where normally we'd be at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive at BAMPFA, behind my colleague Elizabeth's back of the museum, which was designed by Diller and Scafito. And usually we saunter over to one work of art, and you get to hear somebody from UC Berkeley or GTU, graduate student or professor, talk about a work of art in a leisurely way. And then we adjourn upstairs to have a nice glass of something at Babette, the wonderful cafe there, which is now also closed. So we can't do that, but I still want to try and replicate that free-form dialogue. So how we're going to run today is I'm going to give a little bit of a gloss and background before we look at the one image we've selected for today, this haunting photograph by Richard Misrach, which comes from his series of images he made after the Oakland Hills fire of 1991. And we're going to talk about it briefly. And then I'm going to add another little contextual layer on top of that image to sediment it into art history, how I see this photograph resonating in a larger kind of ecology of images. And then we'll have a more free-form discussion coming back to the image again at the end. And by that time, wherever you are in the world, hopefully it's a chance to maybe open a beer or a glass of wine, and we can have a virtual toasting. I'll delegate one of my kids to get me a beer from the refrigerator that's behind me. Not happening. In the downstairs. That's my oldest right there. Right, so that's sort of the format. I should say at the outset, going into this, I have good friends who are chiming in from around the country, even around the world, who are much more grounded in art history than I am. I'm a little bit of an interloper. My training and background is in literary theory and cultural studies. So I'm always a little apprehensive when I play with images and put them into a broader stream of art. So apologies for playing loose. And thanks, Kate. Thanks for the plug. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to slideshow mode. And ideally, this will be a little bit more engaging than just watching a PowerPoint on your computer screen. We'll have a chance for some engagement with the images. And we'll say share screen here. Hold on one second. I'm also coordinating the waiting room. Okay, everybody from the waiting room is now in the space with us. So we'll say share desktop. And hopefully you can see that. Now we'll go into mode. Okay. And everybody can see that, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So let me move my little Brady Bunch box to the side. I'm still figuring out the bells and whistles of Zoom. Here we go. Right, so the image we're talking about is by Richard Misrach. And I don't want to spend too much time going into a long digression on his very interesting life, autobiography. Hold on, let me just see. There's something happening on the top of the screen. Elizabeth and Lydia, you can't see if there's someone needing to come in. Okay, this is just chat. I'm going to ignore the chat for the moment. If you have a question, okay, hold on everybody, I've lost control of my screen sharing.
Devin, I learned from our Blake seminar that if someone's in the waiting room, it actually will blink at you. So you'll be able to see them, I think, on the top bar. But it is hard to see that when you're trying to do the screen share. But
okay, just bear with me, guys. Thanks so much for your patience. There's something not clinking right with my keynote when I play the images. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. All right.
Is this going well, do you think?
Okay. There you go. For whatever, I don't know why that happened. For whatever reason, I wasn't able to move between the slides, but I've gained control back. So here's a better image of the photograph, which is quite large, which was on display at BAMPFA, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, for a show called Lands of Promise and Peril, which was put together collaboratively by undergraduate students at UC Berkeley. So I'm sad we can't all be there in person to see this image in a larger context drawn from the collection of BAMPFA. This image was given to the Berkeley Art Museum by Richard Misrach himself. And over the course of his career as a photographer, he's had a very close relationship to this institution and to the University of California. So just,
Right up there.
and if you're not muted, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself, that would be appreciated. And we're going to come up to a space soon where you can come back in with questions and comments. So here's Richard Misrach. I'm sure some of you Berkeleyans who are joining us today have met Misrach or seen him in action in Berkeley. He was born in 1949 in Los Angeles, but it's really the East Bay and Berkeley in particular that have given shape to his whole arc of photography making. He studied psychology at UC Berkeley in the 60s during the free speech movement, and sort of came of age as an activist and also a photographer on the streets that were riven by conflict and violence between protesting students, riot police, the National Guard. His first major photography show was a project about the homeless people on Telegraph Avenue, which he received a major award for, and it helped catapult him into art school, where he went on to become really one of the most preeminent landscape photographers in America in the post-war period up to the present. He's maintained a base in Berkeley since those student days, and he still lives in the same, or still works in, I should say, still is developing his images in a collaborative artist space in Berkeley that he's had since 1971 or 72, I believe. He's most famous for his images of the American desert, but I'm sure Berkeleyans in the room are also probably familiar with his very iconic images of the Golden Gate Bridge that he's taken from his home up in the Berkeley Hills. So that's all I'm going to say about Misrach's life, and I don't want to think we need to read that biography into the images we're looking at today when we come to them. I first encountered Misrach as a grad student. If we hold one second, I need to admit one person from the waiting room.
Bloody latecomers.
A late interloper, that's okay. So I first heard or learned about Misrach when I was in grad school at the City University of New York in New York City. And I began reading postmodern theory, including this book by Jean Baudrillard, which is about the artifice of American life, the simulacra. And the cover of this book, which sort of fascinated me when I began reading it in 2003 in my PhD intro to literary theory, is taken from Misrach's long cycle of images of the desert in the West, which he's called the desert cantos, assigning different numbers to these cantos, which are thematically grouped into series of images. Later on, when we come to a moment where we can talk with one another, I'd be curious if any of you have seen this image before. It's become quite iconic as an image of the West. This is a space in the California desert. I also encountered Misrach in the reading I began to do when I was starting to write my dissertation about 19th century ecological aesthetics, on historians and writers who were attentive to the cultural power of landscape. And Misrach's photographs are building on this older representational strategy and practice of landscape painting of the American West that really catapulted American 19th century aesthetics front and center into a major mode of cultural representation. I thought I would share two brief snippets from some of the reading I was doing now almost 2 decades ago when I first encountered Misrach's work in words in these books that I was reading for graduate school. The first comes from the work of Mike Davis, who's a cultural critic, who writes about the environment, sort of the history of our turbocharged capitalism in the 20th and 21st century. And Mike Davis has a beautiful moment in this book, Dead Cities, which was published almost 20 years ago, about these cycle of images that Misrach made of the American West and the desert, of toxic waste dump sites that were connected to the mining of uranium and other highly carcinogenic chemicals, and the wastelands on public land and also private farmland of ranchers' cattle that became poisoned by these things. This is the image we have in front of us, Dead Animals number 156. So I'm just going to read you a little bit from Mike Davis's Dead Cities to give you a flavor of how people have been talking about these images. As a short text explains for these images, it is commonplace for local livestock to die mysteriously or give birth to monstrous offspring. Ranchers are officially encouraged to dump the cadavers of the animals, no questions asked, in unmarked county-run pits. Misrach originally heard of this Bosch-like landscape from a local Paiute poet. When he asked for directions, he was advised to drive into the desert and just watch for the flocks of crows. The carrion birds feast on the eyes of the dead livestock. The pit sequence in the desert cantos by Misrach has often been compared by critics to Picasso's Guernica. It is certainly a nightmare reconfiguration of traditional cowboy cliches. The lush photographs are repellent, elegiac, and hypnotic at the same time. Misrach may have produced the single most disturbing image of the American West since ethnologist James Mooney countered Frederick Remington's popular paintings of heroic cavalry charges with stark photographs of the frozen corpses of Indian women and children slaughtered by the 7th Cavalry Hotchkiss guns at Wounded Knee in 1890. So that's Mike Davis. I now want to turn briefly, because she's a local writer. Mike Davis is LA-based, writes about LA, and I wanted to go to someone closer to home, from Rebecca Solnit, of course, who has just published her wonderful memoir about her growth as an intellectual. And hold on just one second. There's a door open and some noise in the background, so I'm going to ask that door to be shut. Hey, kids, could you shut the door, please?
Okay, Devin? Hey, Devin?
Gallery talk from home.
Devin?
Yes.
Devin, we're actually going to switch host to Lydia so that she can take care of other people trying
It's
to come
okay,
in.
Elizabeth. I just did it and everything's
did?
fine. We can
Okay.
just keep going ahead.
We can keep going? Okay.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you. So let me minimize this screen so I can get rid of the waiting room there. Okay. So here's Solnit may or may not be familiar to you. She's a great writer about place, about walking, about feminist politics. And she really fundamentally shaped my own thinking when I was in graduate school too many years ago now about the cultural force and power of representations like landscapes. So just a little bit from a longer paragraph in Rebecca Solnit's book, a collection of essays, Savage Dreams, A Journey into the Hidden Wars of the American West. By the middle of the 1980s, Misrach's Desert Cantos work bore witness to an array of human follies in the American outback. Man-made fires, floods, ruins, and abandoned settlements. Tourists standing in a dry lake bed gawking at an empty sky where a space shuttle was supposed to appear. That's the image, that's the cover of Baudrillard's book, America. As time went on, the military in the desert became a central concern of his work, and he photographed the Enola Gay hangar in Wendover, Utah, where the pilots who bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki trained, the test site and the actions there, and the illegal Navy bombings of public land at Bravo 20 bombing range. Misrach called each series a canto, after Dante's cantos about hell, purgatory, and paradise, and his last canto has been called The Pit, which is what we're looking at here. It documented a place near Fallon, Nevada, where ranchers dumped livestock that had died of diseases or unknown causes. The images gave a subject that would be normally only handled in the grainy black and white of photojournalism, a monumental lushness, a subtlety of color that made eyes linger on the atrocities. the animal pictures had taken landscape, or perhaps even nature, photography beyond where it had ever been before, eliminating the horizon in the distance, describing the bloated, twisted corpses of Mustang foals and Hereford cows and longhorns in the poetic language usually reserved for the reassuringly beautiful. These bodies, which had literally been thrown away, took on the sensual immediacy of the warm-hued bodies of saints and concubines in Baroque painting. A dead steer was foreshortened in the same way as in Caravaggio's painting of a man fallen into the foreground from his horse in the Conversion of St. Paul, which we see right here, and carried the same revelatory weight. It was these pictures that had sprung to my mind early this morning while I was watching the sheriffs drag the bodies of the protesters off the highway. And then Solnit goes back to her meditation on anti-nuclear activism in the California desert. And I just wanted to read that moment from Solnit and show the painting she gestures towards, because when I look at Misrach, it's certainly working within a tradition and a genre of landscape photography, but it's also heavily painterly. And I want us to be talking and meditating about that more when we turn to the image. So now let's move towards the subject at hand, this image from Misrach's haunting pictures of the Oakland Hills firestorm. There may be some of us coming in today. I know at least two people who I saw in the waiting room who are much longer residents of Berkeley than I am, who were probably around when this awful event happened. The fire, up until the more recent wildfires of the last 2 years, was the worst in California's history. It killed 25 people, injured 150 others, and destroyed about 3,502 homes, about one every 11 seconds as the fire unfolded. And if I were to put my computer out the door here where the light is coming in, we could almost just see the hill where this began behind the Claremont Hotel, the Claremont Hills. It's very close to all of us who live here in Berkeley. This image is not by Misrach. I just grabbed this as a screenshot from, I think, the San Francisco Chronicle, showing residents trying to save their home desperately. So it was a very, very traumatic kind of event. So Misrach visited the hills a week after they burned to the ground, causing this enormous devastation to life and people's property. He developed them and he sat on them. He didn't show them. In fact, he waited exactly 20 years until 2011 before he let them be publicly exhibited. In fact, I came to Berkeley in 2011, and I had heard about these images, and it was like a punch to the gut when I first saw them on display at the Oakland Museum of California and at BAMPFA. Those are the two venues where Misrach showed to first bring these up into the light. He was clear that he saw his images as not just being a testimony or witness to the devastation, but part of a historical record that he wanted to, in his words, transcend the spectacle. I want to transcend the news. I don't want to be part of the media, he said in response to the images that came out of this. So here's the one that is currently on display in the closed, lockdown Berkeley Art Museum, part of the Lands of Promise and Peril exhibition. And what I would like to do now with Lydia, my colleague over at the Center for the Arts and Religion, now hosting the meeting, I'll let her MC this, is I'd like to generate some observations from all of you who've joined us about what you see in the image. But I would like to resist the temptation to jump into interpreting this image or cannibalizing it as Rebecca Solnit did with a Caravaggio painting of the like. We'll get there down the road. First, I just want to ask you, what do you see? How can we do a thick description of all the salient physical things that pop out of this large-scale color photograph taken a week after that disastrous fire in the Oakland Hills in 1991. So even if you're not an art historian, you still have eyes. I'd love to hear some thoughts about what you observe happening in this photograph. And you can also put it into the chat box on the side. And Lydia, do we have any hands? I can't see. I can only see
I
Elizabeth.
don't see anybody's hand.
Okay.
But raise your hand if you have. Oh, Judith. Judith's got a question.
Great.
Not a question. I just am struck by the flowering trees in the midst of all the devastation.
Yeah. Thank you, Judith. That's great. So I'm writing it down. If we were in a classroom, Mike would put this up on the board. We can't do that, obviously, in the gallery space at BAMPFA, but that's a great notice of the tension that's created between the flowering trees, the green, and the burnt, desiccated shells of dead trees that have caught on fire.
We got Robin as well. Go ahead, Robin.
The pool strikes me, it's mesmerizing or whatever, because it's interesting how these natural disasters can terrorize the whole surrounding but leave one thing untouched. In the pool seemingly looks almost untouched in the midst of all the devastation. I lived in Florida during some serious hurricanes, and it was the same similar thing. Roofs had been blown off and stuff, but in the middle of all, there'd be something that was like completely untouched, just sitting there. I just think that's amazing how that happens. I don't know.
Hi, Robin. So good to see you. Yeah.
I didn't know if you'd remember where I was from.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for tuning in from far away. That's a great observation. I agree. I think this photograph, the center of it in all kinds of ways, not just in terms of the creation of three-dimensional space, is the swimming pool. So we should talk about that, what the swimming pool does. Anybody else?
This is Charlotte Strem. Hi, can I talk?
Hi, Charlotte.
Hi, Devin. I was here for the 91 Oakland Hills fire, and what comes to me is the recollection that people tried to escape the fire by being in the middle of their swimming pools, and some survived and some didn't. But, you know, the reality of what a swimming pool usually is as a place of recreation versus what it might have become was a salvation of a source of water or potentially life protection.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for that very personal gloss and anecdote. And because these images also show a trauma, we can make space at the end of today for any of those of you who are here for this to maybe speak more personally about it. As just a very quick aside, and maybe we'll take one or two more remarks about the image. I was so struck at the irony and paradox of me. I've been the primary grocery getter for my family, so I geared up, like putting on battle armor with the gloves, the mask, and I went down to Berkeley Bowl, and of course there was a crazy long line. It was going to take forever, and I knew I wouldn't have enough time to prepare for my talk today. So I pulled out a piece of paper, and I was trying to write my notes for what I wanted to say today and what I wanted to look at with my mask on at Berkeley Bowl and Oregon Street with the hills sort of behind. And it just really struck me how that moment of catastrophe and how it was represented and shown, here we are in our own kind of pandemic moment of unprecedented experiences where the everyday gets overturned and it becomes kind of a saga. And just like people who lived through the Berkeley Hills fire, everyone can remember who I've talked to. Oh, I remember when I first saw the plume of smoke or heard the sirens or smelled it through my window. I think we're all having these experiences with coronavirus where our bodies are being marked by history, and will be something we will remember to our toes for years and years to come. But, I could even show you, here's my grocery shopping list on one side. On the other side, I have my penciled in notes, because I knew it would take me an hour to get into the Berkeley Bowl to get fresh vegetables.
Good use of time.
Yeah. Let's hear one or two more remarks about the image itself. We've noticed the pool. We've observed the contrast between flowering trees, the greenness, and the brown. I know we have some artists in the room, including my mother, who's chiming in from the East Coast in Maryland. She's a painter. So if any of you people who make art, who think about the creation of three-dimensional space, have any observations to share as
it looks like
painters.
Paul has something to say. Paul, you're unmuted. If you
Great, Paul, excellent.
Thanks.
Hi, Paul.
Hi, how's it going, guys? This is so wonderful that we can actually have a nice discussion like this. That's not just my undergraduates, so I'm having a great time. The one thing that being somewhat formalist about this is an image, and he chose a very specific space to take the image. Obviously, as you said, it's a frame, a flat frame looking at an oblique pool. That's true, but if you look around, there's a yellow ribbon right next to that tree that is echoed by a yellow ribbon that's closer on the far left.
Excellent.
A lot of the formal elements all match one another. So
yes.
By virtue of the frame of the photo, it still has a highly aesthetic quality to it. The muted
Fantastic.
colors, and someone made
yes.
the juxtaposition between the green. So formally, it's not just as if he just came up and said, oh, here's a snapshot. It does seem very thought out, and our eyes, move in a very certain way. There are rhythmic qualities to it. So there is an underlying aesthetic, even though we would tend to immediately leap to a meaning. The swimming pool represents wealth. But and it's also elemental: water, earth, fire.
Yes.
But it's also about wealth and how that can easily be taken away. So there are meanings that we can add to this, but there's something very compelling to me about the image as a formal device. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Paul. It's so good to hear your voice. Paul is a friend who's an art historian in Arizona who was supposed to be in San Francisco for a little conference I had planned a couple of weeks ago. That, of course, got nixed by the pandemic as it was unfolding. I think Paul's comments are spot on if we recalled what I shared about Misrach himself talking about his wish for his images to transcend the spectacle of the media and the news. He wanted them to do something other than simply show the horror and work as a kind of evidence of the horror that had happened. And there's
I think, Devin, can I jump in there on that?
Please do. Who is this? I can't see your face.
Oh, sorry, it's Laura.
Laura, yes, from London. You get the prize for the longest distance to come in here, and also an artist. That's great. Great to hear you. See you.
Well, the transcending the news. Yeah. What interests me about this, I guess, I wasn't picking up the symbol of the pool and wealth. I was seeing it more like, here's a man-made construction. But in this image, it's almost like it's gone back to nature. It's not a natural shape, but the quality of the water compared to what the water would be if it were a working swimming pool. The quality of the water, it's gone back to nature.
Yes.
So everything about the pool looks far more natural than it would. So it's almost this kind of mirror where the man-made meets meets nature, and nature kind of takes it back. Do you see what I mean?
100%. And I think you're getting to the heart of why the pool is such a compelling formal device in the image. in a way, this is kind of what W.J.T. Mitchell or another critic like him would call a meta picture. It's an image about image making by virtue of the fact that we're looking at a double frame. There's the frame of the picture itself, but the pool is also representing the landscape through the image, the inverse image of the trees and the landscape around it. So there's a doubling that happens, and we get sort of a space of reflection in between. This is not just a representation, it's a representation of a representation, one that's natural, made by the elemental power of water to refract light and capture images. And this is interesting because
he de-emphasizes the sky. The sky, usually the sky is a major feature in landscape photography, landscape imagery in general.
Yes.
And the sky is almost non-existent. It's all about.
Yes, it creates a heaviness. And I think some of you know Misrach's other work, the Desert Cantos and his series about the Golden Gate, the image of the Pacific Rim from Berkeley. It's all about the sky and sort of the sublime optic of the clouds and the light. This pulls us down and in. The darkest parts of the photograph, color-wise, are in the pool. So there's a way it almost functions as like a vortex that pulls us down and in formally. And that's just to make a remark, not even getting to sort of what this does in terms of metaphor or resonating with certain cultural associations. It's what happens to our physiognomy as we look at the image. We are drawn down and in to that pool by the choice of color, the time of day, and how it's been developed in the darkroom. So this is great. I think yes. Do I hear another voice?
Well put.
Okay, thanks, Paul. If my friend Paul, who's a real art historian, is giving me the thumbs up, then I can rest easy here on that. Let's go to a slightly different mode, and I'm going to give you a few images where I think this particular work by Misrach resonate in a larger cultural reference. This is just sort of my own playing around with where this image takes and goes. So we'll look at those, and then we'll come back at the end for a larger sort of free-for-all. And if you want to join us for happy hour, wherever you are in the world, we could pop a beer over the screen. If I can convince my oldest to fetch me a bottle. She seemed kind of reluctant to want to do that. So Misrach himself, when these images were finally shown after 20 years of being hidden from view at the Oakland Museum of California, said he sees them as being akin to Matthew Brady's work. This is the great photographer of the Civil War who often photographed emptied battle landscapes. And these images function as both documentary, visual witnessing to the horror of the Civil War and its violence, but they're also highly aestheticized images, as many art historians and people who've written on the history of photography have pointed out, that Brady had a careful, deliberate choice about his vantage points and the way things arrange themselves to create, in this image, for example, what happens formally for you when you look at this pretty well-known, you might have seen it before, image of a battlefield in Virginia with Confederate dead behind a stone wall? And do you see anything coming into it after we've just been looking at Misrach's swimming pool? Is there a formal kinship or familiarity?
Well, the diagonal of the trench really draws you back into the distance.
Yeah.
And
hi, David. Yeah, great.
Hi. And the rifles set up a particular rhythm as they move backwards. I mean, it's almost as if they were placed in that position so regular.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
And I was going to say that diagonal that David mentioned is similar to the diagonal of the pool.
Yeah.
It kind of draws your eye over the hill.
Yeah.
And if I may say, the placement of the rifles that first rifle in the foreground, and then the next one, and then the one that's leaning against the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he may very well have moved those. It's true that the case of the moved soldiers or case of the moved, rifles might apply here.
Yes, 100%. Excellent observations.
What I
It's
was
interesting.
also,
Yeah.
what I was also thinking was the trees. The trees kind of go along with the trench that kind of pull your eye, or your eye follows that to the tree. And it was the same with the pool. The reflection of the tree and the pool, but it also led to that main tree up, it kind of, your eye would follow that.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great, Robin. And you're hitting a really important point of continuity between these two, which really embed them into a larger aesthetic strategy and trope of landscape, which is that of the ruin, where the presence of the human is confronted with nature, usually through the fragment or depicting a ruin in some way. Here it's the ruin of bodies and this stone wall that had been used in the battle. And in the Misrach picture, it's the ruined house, the chimney, the stove that are juxtaposed with the green trees around them. So as I and many others have written, the landscape space as a representational mode from the 19th century onwards is really the stage and venue for Western culture working out its anxieties about modernization, technology, sort of a budding ecological consciousness begins to percolate in romantic landscape painting. And on that mode, I just wanted to very briefly touch on two paintings that I think amplify some of this, which are closer to Misrach than Matthew Brady. Well, maybe we'll look at one, and we'll take a brief detour back in time into the earlier Romantic era. And I want to do this because, again, critics like Rebecca Solnit, Mike Davis, who I began by reading those two little excerpts from, they have often talked about Misrach in terms of painting and not just photography, and that there's something in his stylistic choices and the color saturation that he develops the images with that evoke the lush brushwork of, a Caravaggio, if we went back to that image of the conversion of St. Paul, which Solnit addresses. So here's one example of this mode in Romantic landscape painting, very famous, Caspar David Friedrich, the great German early Romantic painter, Abtei im Eichwald, the Abbey and the Oak Forest. If you've been to Berlin, you've probably been to the National Gallery. You might have seen this painting in person. It's a lot smaller than you might think it is. It's sort of looms large in art history. It's taken on an iconic symbolism of its own. And unfortunately, I can't see with my presentation up if people are chatting on the bar. So I'll just let Lydia field that if people are making comments or questions about this. Does anyone want to make a remark about this painting we're looking at, where again, we have a ruin. We have that nature-culture divide, which I think Misrach, always in his work, that's the tension, is the collapse and convergence and tension between nature and culture, man-made landscape, natural landscape. We have this here too in Friedrich. So anyone want to comment on this, especially if somebody has seen this in the National Gallery?
I have seen it. It's an amazing painting. It's actually it's over 5 feet long, so it's actually still pretty large. But what I remember about it most is how the atmosphere itself begins to almost overwhelm. The way he built up the color, that light really does start to penetrate your own space. It's an absolutely magical kind of moment, and this kind of deific quality of the light through not only the church window, which has been destroyed, but also, of course, the oaks. So yes, it's an absolutely stunning work. Hopefully everyone go to Berlin and see the painting.
When we can fly to Europe again, sooner than later, one can only hope. Thank you, Paul, that's great. Many have seen this as sort of an opportunity to think about the endowment of nature with sort of a spiritual power, the atmospheric light that Paul just described, which I think you only really see when you look at this painting in person. Sort of the flat computer screen JPEG that I put up here doesn't do it. You really have to let the color sort of unfold through the layers of paint. With Friedrich, they're shining through this empty stained glass window. The glass is no longer there. It's just the diaphanous light and mist of this oak forest that's pouring through. And I wanted to look at this image too, because there's a kind of smokiness about the atmospherics, the spiritual haze that's in it. And there's kind of a hazy quality too, a post-fire mistiness. If you look in the background, where I am speaking to all of you from is the hill in the back of this picture. That's Panoramic Hill across Claremont Canyon from the Claremont Hills. So I could wave my hand out the window, go back in a time machine, say hello. But you'll notice that the air itself, and those of us who've lived through more recent fires in Berkeley understand that sort of sickly brown pallor that comes to the air when the wildfires are thick. That's very much here. So there's a kind of viscosity in this picture that to me really evokes some of the atmospherics of Friedrich's painting. So we can go back in time to Romantic landscape, but I want to also jump ahead closer in time and just briefly play around with the swimming pools of David Hockney, right? So many of you might know Hockney's work. He's a British painter, works in figurative landscape traditions, and he really came onto the scene in the 70s through his paintings of California swimming pools. He sort of became obsessed with this as an image, and there's been a lot of commentary by art historians and critics about Hockney and the swimming pool. So I wonder if Misrach, who's so often been prisoned by art history and cultural critics like Solnit as having a painterly aesthetic and gesturing towards Caravaggio or Picasso and Guernica, if there's not kind of a wry commentary on Hockney in some way, where also again, like the photograph, this is kind of a painting about painting. It's more explicit in Hockney's, and I'm sure many of you know this image, it's probably his most famous swimming pool image, A Bigger Splash, where the swimming pool kind of becomes a meta picture where the 3D representation kind of dissolves and it becomes like an abstract painting where the splash of water is just like a gestural brush of paint that's been moved across the landscape. So it looks like a very minimalist constructed sort of semi-realistic photograph representation of space until you hit that swimming pool and it kind of bounces your eye back into being just an abex flat space of sheer paint moving around in the canvas. So a kind of meta picture moment. And what are these paintings that Hockney painted about? In this one, of course, Hockney is a gay man, really alive in the 1970s in LA with a lot of boyfriends, and there's kind of a, that's certainly evident here in Portrait of an Artist, a pool with two figures, with the figure looking down at the swimming man in his tighty whities below the water. But there's also something about the framing within the frame, the square that is the swimming pool inside the larger box of 3D representation, which I think Misrach is also clearly playing around with as a California painter, a California artist, I should say, not a painter, a California photographer, very well aware of how his images are part of an ecology of representation of the American West. Maybe we'll end here with that juxtaposition between Hockney and the Misrach picture, and we can go back. I'll leave my PowerPoint presentation for now.
Devin, it looks like Kate wants to say something. Kate, I'm gonna unmute.
Great, let's go to like plenary session for a larger chat, and I can see all of your beautiful faces. and if we want to go back to any of the images, I can just pull it up on screen share again. So thanks for tuning in and listening. It's really totally surreal and kind of cool and weird to have like a collision of dear people from all around the world share a Zoom room and talking about art. So, Kate.
Yeah, thank you so much, Devin. That was really rich and wonderful. And I thought of Hockney as soon as I saw the swimming pool. And
Yeah.
I was also thinking about not just his swimming pool piece, but his more recent piece where he actually attached cameras to vehicles and had them go down country lanes in the UK and these like ginnels and snickets and alleyways like along the UK landscape to create an immersive experience. So he took the films that he made on these cars and then had them on like TV screens and had them all right to create an immersive experience.
This was at the Young, wasn't it?
I think so. I mean, yeah, I think it was in a couple different places. But I was thinking about the Friedrich and how my kids are going crazy in the background. I was thinking about the Friedrich and how it comes also out of this tradition of panoramas. So these like immersive viewing experiences. He was like Friedrich was on like the cutting edge of the moment that people started to have these great kind of as we moved later into the 19th century, these immersive panoramas where you can go into these viewing halls and see these great ruins, and the people that kind of followed from Friedrich grabbed onto that. And then, so the last thing that I wanted to say just to make this connection is that I was struck that with the Misrach photography, because of the immediacy of the documentary quality of those photographs of things that were happening at that moment. And as you were saying, like if you just turn the camera out the window, you could see the hills right in the background that mirror what was being portrayed. And so I think that there's this kind of like immersiveness that happens through the photography. There's like a thread of immersive, like embodied experience that the viewer through the Friedrich, through the Hockney, and also in the Misrach photography. So I just wanted to kind of say that all three seem to be engaging like a truly embodied experience of viewership.
Yeah. Thanks, Kate. That's fantastic. And I saw Lydia nodding, so she's confirming my recollection that in some haze, sleep deprived with young children, I saw that piece at the De Young a couple years ago. Misrach's work always pulls me down, or not physically pulls me down, but arrests me, especially the images of the animals and this almost vortex-like way the swimming pool moves us in. Reminds me of what you're saying about movement, but also stasis. It's an image that transcends simply being just a document of horror and catastrophe because of these formal qualities that give pause. And we didn't have time for it, so I didn't go there. But I kind of wanted to throw open as a question for all of you who've come into our virtual gallery for the evening to think about the ethics of how we talk about this image. What does it mean to look at something that is so inscribed with death and cultural trauma? Charlotte, who's here, my friend Charlotte Strum, talked about how those swimming pools were used for people trying to escape the fire. Somebody could have died in this image that Misrach made. And what does it mean then to look at an image where the human has been so violated? There's the ruin of the houses, but as we know, if you look at the history of the Oakland Hills fire, the incinerated humans, the human remains that are in that landscape too, it's almost grotesque if one thinks about it. And I think this is probably one reason why Misrach, out of respect for his fellow Berkeleyans, chose to not circulate these images. Yeah, I see Paul, my friend Paul in LA. Hey, Paul, mentioning the dead people in the Civil War photos. Interesting there to think about Brady, because Brady circulated those images readily and are part of sort of the first way that horrific images of war lead to a new public consciousness about the violence of war, its station and consequences. Whitman's poetry comes out of the war. That's very pacifistic, I think is shaped by the shock of Brady's images. That these were kept hidden for 20 years is just so compelling to me. I won't go there, but I was going to read some, Susan Sontag is one of my favorite critics, from her last book she publishes before she died of cancer in 2003, where she was reflecting on the photographs that came out of Abu Ghraib, the prison in Iraq, that so shocked and scandalized audiences all over the world and galvanized the anti-war movement. And she used them as an opportunity for thinking philosophically, ethically about what it means to regard the pain of others. How do we look at an image that is dripping in cultural trauma and the pain of others? How does one avoid a kind of voyeurism? And I think that Misrach's picture is caught up in the complexity of that. So I've spoken too much. Let's hear, anybody else want to jump in or add on to that?
I wanted to say that you are touching on, when you first and you went to where I was thinking, that this picture really does put you in a philosophical place. For me, when I look at it as a flattened image, the pool becomes a fulcrum and the chimney remains on the left and the scorched trees on the right become two balanced man-made versus nature, and sort of pointing to look at that, you know, of how much we insert ourselves into nature. Not well said, but hopefully you can make some sense.
No, that's great. Thanks, David. Well, if I'm not mistaken, have we been joined by the artist himself as I look through the Zoom room? I see Miriam Misrach. I don't want to. We have a I won't put anybody on the spot. You can stay quiet in the background, but
I'm here too.
Hi, great. Well,
sorry. I really wanted to be in, but I also didn't want to make anybody self-conscious, and I was just thrilled to kind of sneak in and kind of listen, and I didn't want to kind of impact your discussion. So
no, I mean that's amazing.
Anyway, but go on. You're doing great, by the way. It's really by the way, it is fascinating to be to sit on a fly on the log or whatever it is, just kind of seeing what you guys are thinking about.
Yeah. Oh, it's great. It's cool to visually kind of meet you, Richard. My first year in Berkeley, I became close to Jane Dillenberger, who had a copy that you had signed for her in her living room, and it was part of my sort of introduction to your work. Was besides then encountering the images at BAMPFA, was seeing the Golden Gate that she had in her living room. So super cool.
Right. So yeah. Anyway, so again, I don't want to. I mean, I'd love to hear from everybody else and let you do your thing. I just was curious. I mean, it really is to be able to hear other people talk about it. It's pretty strange, but it's fascinating and interesting to see just how people, the thing I guess about images like this is that they're open to interpretation and people come at it different ways, especially with time. I mean, it's been almost 30 years, right? So. And one of the things that I do argue a lot is that photographs do change meaning over time. And so the Brady or whatever, that's always been a really good example. When Brady made those photographs, for a lot of people, those pictures represented their husbands and sons and daughters and their homes being killed and destroyed. Now, 100 years later, we appreciate it as kind of a moment in history where we can learn from that and then know what happened, but it's different. It's the way it's received back then and now is radically different. And so I for the pictures of the Oakland fire and also photographed Hurricane Katrina, which I'd still put away for another till the 20-year anniversary of that too. Same principle.
Okay. Yeah.
Not a spectacle, but I feel like these photographs bear witness in a way that no other medium can. Now I'll shut up. Bye. Keep going.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Well,
The photograph actually becomes the narrative over time. When you look at photographs or footage of Brady or World War I, you know, these images become the narrative. They become the story that we tell. And what interests me about this particular image is because I'm not from California, so I don't have the currency to look at it and know, oh, that picture is that, you know. Hurricane Katrina, because my aunt lives in New Orleans, probably I would do better with that. But so to look at this photograph initially as something separated from the event that gave birth to it, it still presents a puzzle, a really curious puzzle of what is going on here. There's the story here. I don't know what the story is, but, and what really struck me that I didn't mention before is that sort of behind, there's the chimney, but then there's behind, there are what I guess are the smaller chimneys, or the chimneys of the houses down the hill.
Yeah, we can go back. I can pull it up.
Yeah. Like monuments or graves. So it's, and the grave shape of the pool as well. It has quite a grave shape to it in that oblong. With that one smaller chimney that just sort of looks like a headstone, if the pool itself is a grave. So it is, and it does conjure up those images or those stories of in Australia during the fires when they were hurrying into the sea to be, you know, to try to protect themselves.
Yeah, excellent, Laura. And you're really hitting on a way to think about what Richard wonderfully shared about how these meanings come to mean different things as we move forward in time and the narrative context changes. When I look at them now, they seem so prescient. It's like the climate change future, what we might want to call the Anthropocene, is there in these images from 1991, the sort of the everyday reality we now face in the summer and dry months in California, the likelihood of that repeating itself. And of course, the Oakland Hills fire has now been eclipsed by what happened in Paradise and these other, in Sonoma, which have been even much more devastating. And so does that, maybe we could think about the swimming pool at the center of the image, it's sort of blankness shimmering as like a magic mirror for the future. What does it mean to look at these images from our 21st vantage point of climate change?
I don't think of it as, I think of it as the black mirror. Definitely the black mirror. I learned to swim in a pool that looks very much like that. So actually, when I first saw the image, I wasn't thinking anything in the context of the photograph. I was immediately reminded to the memory of a pool that I learned to swim in that was too deep for me, which it wouldn't have had to be very deep at the time, but and the water was, it was black water like that. It was like a forest pool, black, cold, desperately cold water. I have no idea where it was, but it was a square pool shape. And the water was like water cold, really cold, and clear and dark and bottomless like that.
Yeah.
So that was the first image, the first sort of reaction I had was that personal memory.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Laura. And you're underscoring again too some of the elemental dimensions of the photograph. I think that was a word that Paul used to describe the water in it. And there's fire and there's water, and sort of bringing those two together hits us viscerally, especially if a memory like that, where you've been plunged into the black depths. It's a brutal way to learn. All right. Well, any final remarks? You know, we tend to do these for about an hour or so in the gallery, and then we adjourn upstairs to Babette for refreshments and libations. So would anyone care to make a final comment or the like? I'm very interested for those of you out there, like people who are working in art history, like my colleague Kate at the GTU, who was just in the nightly news for her pilgrimage project that she's done from quarantine here in Berkeley. So put a shout out for Kate, working on labyrinths in Berkeley. You'll have to put in the sidebar, Kate, when we can see you.
Being on evening news is a labyrinthian experience, actually.
I was thinking of one thing that really wasn't talked about a whole lot. My initial reaction when I saw the pool photograph was an invasion of privacy in a way. When people go through a serious trauma or death, that is a really intimate, personal moment. And it reminded me of like when in Oklahoma, when the bombings happened there was a big famous photograph of the firemen holding the dead baby. And I had read an article about the mother of that child and how hard it was emotionally to see this image over and over. And having known the Tituses, whose daughter died in 9/11 as a airline stewardess, again, it's the same thing. I've heard them tell that story about seeing these images that are so iconic now, and they're used in political ways and all sorts of other ways all the time. And yet this is a constant reminder for these people that actually directly had this experience. And so it's the meaning is also different for people depending on if you were there or if you just saw it indirectly and stuff like that. So that's very personal. These are very personal moments.
Thank you, Robin, very much. And if you're seeing Misrach's series here for the first time, I would encourage you to, when libraries are open again, to get the book that came out of exhibiting these. The most haunting image in them for me is one of a child's tricycle with bright colors that had been liquefied and melted plastic from the flames. And it's a haunting image, especially as a dad of kids who live in the Berkeley Hills, having faced the fire and knowing kind of the anxiety of what it means to live with children in a high-risk fire zone. And there is an ethics of seeing and representation here. And I think, again, the respect for people who are grieving to not show these images for 20 years is part of that. And I'm a former New Yorker. I lived through 9/11. And I was such a poor, starving graduate student. I didn't have a television at that time. So my sense of that event as it unfolded and the smoke blew across towards our apartment across the East River is very different from sort of the flood of the spectacle of the bodies coming out of the towers that have become icons. And maybe this is part of what Richard meant when he was talking about showing these images after 20 years, that they had to transcend the media and the spectacle of the media, that an image runs a risk of being an icon and becoming detached from the particularity of lives lost. So thank you for raising that, Robin. Okay. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you, everybody, very much for joining our first experiment at doing a gallery talk with Zoom from our different homes and places around the world. Again, it's been totally surreal to have these different parts of my life, private, personal, professional, and the like, collide, but also magical, dreamlike in the best way. And
Devin,
go ahead, Elizabeth.
I just want to say thank you for bringing us all together and for leading us in this new brave new world. To thank everyone for joining in and your patience with us as we, figure out our way forward. Stay tuned. We have a few more events that we are going to be doing online this month. We'll be celebrating Poetry Month on the 27th with some reading and discussion with poet Nate Klug. That's on the 27th. And then we have another art historical talk on the 29th. So stay tuned to what we're doing at the Center for the Arts and Religion. We always, I wouldn't say it's, I don't want to talk about silver linings, but one of the, things to reorient ourselves around, since we're not able to be in our gallery, is how do we get to know this space outside of our gallery, which is, the world, and kind of face outward instead of inward. So thanks for being there with us for part of it. And thanks to Devin. Thanks so much for making it possible for us to get started with that. And for a great and thought-provoking talk, which is also very much of the moment.